Hello, friends. This is John Finnegan. Concerns about the coronavirus are health related, of course, but the economic impact is becoming clearer by the day. According to the New York Times today, the latest initial claims data report through March 28th had us at 4 million people have lost their jobs. We're up to 15 million people unemployed today, which bumped the employment rate to 12.5%. And there are many other disruptions to our life as well. Our guest today says this virus exposes the vulnerabilities of our global supply chain. Jack Buffington is the program director and professor for DU's supply chain program at the Daniels College of Business and the Denver Transportation Institute. Jack will tell you more about his program later, as well as Rick Russin, who's the STEM coordinator at Valor Christian High School, who's responsible for growing that program. So Jack and Rick, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Jack, why are we experiencing these shortages at the grocery store today? We're told that the supply chain is intact, but yet, we can't find so many of our necessities.
Yeah, so maybe to start off with a quick explanation of what is a supply chain. So a supply chain is a system that aggregates supply and demand. So consumers are demanding things and suppliers need to be able to provide it. And most people don't really notice much about the supply chain because whenever they show up to the grocery store, there's plenty of product for whatever they want. And when they click on the button at Amazon, the product shows up at their doorstep 2 days later. So nobody really thinks much about it. It takes a global pandemic shock, as what we're facing right now, to create the changes that we're seeing in the supply chain. And I like to see them in three different categories. The first category are products that aren't necessarily in greater demand, but people are buying more of it because they're scared about what's happening. So that could be things like toilet paper, fresh meats, things like that, that people are buying more than they actually can consume. And that has created a temporary shock on the supply chain that we're starting to see come back to normal as companies forecast prepare for it. Then we have other categories that are in higher demand, and these could be things like hand sanitizers, medical equipment. These are things that are of greater concern because it's not just a matter of irrational consumer behavior of hoarding. It's a matter of life and death. We need more of this for what's going on over probably what will be the next year or so. So the supply chains have to adjust much differently than they do for the temporary pieces. And then there's a third category of disruption of supply chains that may never, ever be the same again after what happened. So all these suppliers are trying to adjust to what is a short-term, a medium-term, and a long-term disruption and what that means to their business, not only locally, but in a global supply chain that we have today.
Rick?
I think it's hard to tell whether it's the difference between hoarding or supply. It's just tough to predict that without having more information.
Both of you guys are in the business of education, but higher education, and Rick at the high school level. What are your students asking about this as it relates to the supply chain and in your STEM program?
I think the students don't understand the supply chain. Things just miraculously show up when they order it, or when they go to the store. They're used to instant gratification. I don't think they understand how long these things take to get through the supply chain. I don't think they understand, the manufacturing through the distribution, through the retail channels that these things go through. And that's what Valor STEM is about, is we have to go from pure academics or core academics and start bringing these real life industry type problems to the students' attention.
Jack, how about your students? What are they asking you about this
situation
that we're going through?
Well, first off, the first thing we were addressing with our students is a change in the approach of education. So we started the spring quarter last week. And so the first thing is a disruption for how they learn, right? So instead of learning on campus, they have to learn through Zoom. So that's the first shock that we're working with our students. But then after that, if there's a silver lining, there's a much greater interest today in supply chain than there ever has been, which is good because I think people understand the significance that it has to our economy, not just in iPhones that they buy, but critical life and death equipment at a hospital, right? But really, it's the same theme of what I talk about in my program, regardless of what's happening. Is that in our program, we focus on teaching students how to be problem solvers. And I consider our program, to tie to what Rick's working on, I consider it to be a STEMmy program. So supply chain is really about science, technology, engineering, and math. And so we solve problems through data. We solve problems through analysis. And whether you work in supply chain consulting, marketing, or whatever field, and then this is more important for students now. You can imagine my juniors and seniors who are staring at the prospects of 30% unemployment and entering the job market are a little bit concerned about what's happening. And so I give them the advice that, if you're a problem solver and you know how to solve problems through big organizations, getting things done in structured methods through people, regardless of the economy, you'll do better. And so that kind of eases them to focusing on what they have to do as opposed to, the bigger picture of things that they can't control.
Jack, you've written several books and focused on plastics and plastic waste, and you and I have had a number of discussions about this. And you're beginning to convince all of us that we've got a serious problem, and it's more serious than we think we're doing a good thing by recycling each week. But your books tell a different story.
Yeah, actually, if I can go before those books, is I started writing books on plastic waste because starting in 2006, when I started to write books about the problem with global supply chains and the lack of resiliency, people weren't listening to me because the stock market was doing so good and the job market was doing so well. So it's funny how that comes back to circle, right? And that really, here we are now. People are wanting to talk more about this than to talk about the problem of plastic waste. And so some people are like, well, we just can't worry about plastic waste today because we have to focus on the economy. And yet it's the same problem. The books I wrote about 14 years ago were, this global model that's not resilient for communities, that's not resilient for the national security of our country, is the same problem of 93% of all plastic going to waste and 12% flowing into the oceans every year. It's a problem of, supply chain that's broken. It's a problem of a lack of structured problem solving. And this is just an endemic problem that we faced for the first 3 decades of this century or this century millennial. And I think people are going to start paying attention to it given the criticality of the problems we face.
Jack, we talk about a new normal happening for all of us as consumers initially. It affects our daily lives. It's front and center. But think about it relative to businesses and how it's going to impact businesses. Not just that we're having video conferences like the one that we're on right now, but in other ways, that especially as it affects the supply chain.
Yeah, I think there's some really interesting dynamics at place here. And I think, of course, it's difficult for us to see it today because right now we're under a pandemic, right? So I think what we're seeing right now is leading some people to believe that this so-called new normal is a circumstance of lack of business opportunity, maybe having to change how we live our lives. And I'm not as sold that that's the circumstance. I think we're already starting to see changes in the dynamics of business models and supply chains even before this happened. There's some clear economic trends, although it's not so clear in the stock market or the employment numbers that things were beginning to change. And so, how consumers and suppliers interface with each other, instead of long supply chains that start in China where, a smartphone will be made from 45 different countries, or Procter & Gamble has, thousands, they have hundreds of thousands of products that are made by, thousands of suppliers in China, right? Or the pharmaceutical industry where 80% of the active ingredients come from outside this country. A new model of economics, of a more resilient, shorter tailed supply chain, instead of relying on things to be made all around the world. Things made within a community model through high technology, through 3D printing, through peer-to-peer sort of relationships where people connect one day as a consumer and the next day they connect as a supplier. So these things are already emerging, and I think they're really exciting if we can get past this old paradigm of how supply chains are supposed to work, which is this problem that we're facing today. So maybe this will be the catalyst for moving in this new direction.
We think about the inconveniences of our lives today, but think about the three of us met, 25 years ago. We've known each other a long time. And think about pre-internet days. If this coronavirus would have hit us then, we wouldn't be having a video conference every day and being able to conduct business for many businesses quite normally. So we're quite fortunate in that respect.
Well, there's still some other factors too. In addition to the internet, Valor was really positioned well. I don't know whether intentionally, because we've been working toward it, or just happens to be an opportune time. But we've been digitizing our curriculum for the past 2 years. And so almost everything we do is online. We do presentations through our student information system and our knowledge management systems. And that's helped us to transition because most of our lesson plans were already online. We give them through various Apple devices. We are a great user of Apple products, with every staff member having a MacBook and an iPad and an Apple TV in their classroom. So a lot of schools, they share computer resources at the library, and a lot of classrooms don't have the laptops or the iPads, but we do that, and that's how we present our classes. It's interesting that you mentioned plastics. I want to go back to that. So I was committee chair at the Cherry Creek Arts Festival for the first 8 years of that festival. 3 of those years I ran the environmental committee, and we won numerous awards for recycling over 96% of the waste that went into that festival. And the majority of it was plastics, number 6 plastics, 3 plastics, 4 plastics. And the way we controlled that was by controlling what's coming in to the festival, so that we knew that we could recycle those materials. At Valor, it's an interesting thing because, again, you talk about shortening the supply chain, and that's what I teach my students is advanced manufacturing is really shortening it, where the consumer is becoming the manufacturer in a certain way with 3D printing, laser cutters, things like that. So one of the things we're trying to do to incorporate waste control at Valor is taking all the plastic cutlery that the 1,200 students use throughout the day, and then you multiply that times the week, and seeing if we can actually make 3D printing filament out of it, and just start with that. Then we'll move to plastic cups, move to some other waste materials. So that falls within the Christian mission valors of trying to, do something to serve others and preserve the environment.
Jack, how's it impacting your students? And you guys, I'm sure, were very prepared. I've been in your classroom before, and I don't think I wouldn't think it would have that much of an impact. Am I wrong?
You're not wrong. However, I would say it's much different from an undergraduate class to a graduate school class, because what we pride ourselves at the University of Denver are small face-to-face classes, which is really critical to helping a student learn beyond just material that's on a website or in a book or anything like that. So you can imagine You have, a lot of students in small classes of 20 to 30 students, where they're having very high touch interactions with their professor, to moving back into their parents' house for a short period of time over a Zoom and not having that face-to-face connection with their classmates and their students. So we've tried to give them a couple weeks to adjust to it. But what I'm really trying to focus on now, starting week 2, is making sure that they move forward. Because one thing I'm concerned about is, especially in a business school, right, when you're going to have graduates moving into the workforce, is going to be highly competitive, that I need to get them ready for what they're about to face, because what's happening in the economy could probably, at least short term, have a disruption for a couple years. And this is the time where they're all going to enter the job market. So, I follow up with a lot of one-on-one conversations on careers, really try to make sure that they're moving forward every day. And that's at the beginning of every class, we have this move forward conversation. And tomorrow we're going to talk about that. There's 3 things that they need to have. And that is, one of them is what they know. They need to improve what they know, including critical thinking. The second thing they need to improve upon is who they know. So that's their network. And the third thing they need to focus on are their achievements, is that what they've accomplished. And so I want, especially given I always tell these guys, you spend probably a couple hours a day on social media. So you can spare 30 minutes a day to focus on these things related to your career. And I think not only does this help them move forward, but it also takes some of the angst that's going on in the world, because they're making progress every day towards their career.
Yeah, as you tell that story, Jack, I'm thinking it sounds like you're dealing with mental health as much as, the education of these students. You have to be, really in tune to what they're feeling.
Yeah, and I think you both know that, given your experience in business, that that's what we do, right? So we're, as leaders of teams or managers or salespeople working with customers, is that we have to be in tune with the interpersonal dynamics, what's happening with that person on that day, right? So it's important for me to work with them so that, number one, they can move forward, but also for them to, understand what business is all about. And we have, I'm still in industry, as you know, John. So, I share with them the conversations I'm having with my team, because, it's the same problem that's happening right now in industry with leaders of people.
Mm-hmm. What about, let's talk a little bit about business in general, and what are you experiencing on the front lines of the company that you continue to work for?
So I think, this gets into these phases, I think, and we're in this shock phase right now where, I work for a beer company, a beer manufacturer, Miller Coors. We're not selling a lot of beer, right? There's no bars that are open. People are not buying cases of beer for parties because, it's just social distancing and everything like that. So we're in this bunker mentality right now where we're trying to adjust what it means for our supply chain, not necessarily for this month, but probably for the rest of the year. Mm-hmm. What do our forecasts look like when this thing starts to release? So a lot of the experts are talking about, let's call it end of May, early June, where we start to see a semblance of normality in society. Nobody really knows what that means. There's not clear definitions of, does that mean that it's football stadiums are open? Does it mean that, there's rock concerts? Does it mean that people can have parties of 25 people? Does it mean that bars are open? I mean, these are all the things that are factored into our 6-week forecast, because that's the time period that we have in order to make a product, in order to be able to ship it to our distributors who sell it to our retailers. So we're trying to postulate an answer to all these questions that nobody has an answer to, which we're not the only supply chain that's facing that. I mean, this is the same. I mean, imagine what's going on if you provide food to restaurants, or imagine what's happening if you, you build production lines, or, we can go on and on about this, right? Disneyland. Some of my graduate students work at Disneyland. So, what's that going to look like in the next whatever? So I would say right now we're kind of in this shock, but we're starting to think through what the rest of the year looks like, and we're coming up with very vague answers to that.
was talking recently to the CEO of a company that distributes fresh fish products, and one of his customers is King Soopers, and he was proud that they actually asked them to find chicken. There's an example of them adapting, going outside what they would normally do, but it's what the customer needed, and so just adapting.
Yeah, if I can tell you about one of my partners at the university that I'm very proud of, that's in a completely different predicament, and that is the hospital supply chain. So
Yes.
I do a lot of work with Centura Health, who's a large hospital provider here in Colorado. They run 17 hospitals, both in Colorado as well as I think one in Kansas. And Cardinal Health, who's the large distributor for a lot of their products. Cardinal Health is one of the world's largest distributor of healthcare products. And listening to them talk about how they are working through what's going on in their supply chain. And what I love it I've just reached out to them a couple of times and offer my support because we do a lot of work together. And their response was, "Hey, this is what we live for. This is why we're in the field. We're hanging in there and we're making things happen, but it's every day is a new challenge." And so I think about that when I think about the criticality of our supply chains. And some people think beer is important, and it kind of is socially.
Sure.
But then you think about that, you think about them, and there's a potential for Colorado to have this increase in COVID-19 cases, and for how they prepare for that. So how would their forecasts look over the next 6 months? And so I think about that when I think about me preparing for a beer forecast. They can't be wrong, right? If I'm wrong, maybe somebody doesn't get as much Coors Light as they wanted to buy, or we make more than people need. If they get it wrong, it's a matter of life and death. But I would say the same thing for them as it is for me. They really don't have any idea what this next 6 months to 2 years are going to look like.
The key is that we need to be not thinking, gee, I wish things would return to normal so I can sell more beer, for example, as I did before, that being normalcy for that individual, but thinking that the future may and will be different. And how can we innovate? I think those are going to be the survivors going forward. Rick Russin, have I missed any questions that you'd like to ask, by the way?
No, I was just wondering, you mentioned in one of the other interviews about shortening the supply chain. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, this is something that's been on my mind for quite a while. I grew up in the city of Baltimore, which is one of these legendary Rust Belt cities that back in the 1960s and the 70s, the largest steel mill in the world was in Bethlehem Steel, which is in Sparrows Point, Maryland, right in Baltimore. So you watch what happened in supply chain and manufacturing in a large part of our country that just disappeared, right? And it's probably well beyond the scope of this interview to talk about how and why it happened, but it has happened, right? And so there's been certain communities that have been left behind as we move to this so-called knowledge economy, right? So the wish for management thinkers back in the 80s and 90s when I was going to graduate school, guys like Peter Drucker talked about everybody's going to become a knowledge worker, right? And so a lot of us have moved in that path, except some of us haven't, right? And then lately, knowledge work has turned into something that computers do through artificial intelligence. And the rest of the world catches up through this wondrous thing called the internet, which means people like me can outsource IT work and human resource work and all kinds of work all over the world, right? So we truly live in this global world. But we have to remember that these supply chains were in place and created wealth and the well-being of society through this multiplier that happens within a community, right? And we've lost that, right? So we've lost through having products made with very large scale and precision in China, whether it's a smartphone or, in the United States, we don't manufacture penicillin anymore. We don't manufacture vitamin C. We don't manufacture a lot of critical, drugs and supplies, right? So how we define efficiency needs to change. And there are uses of technology and creativity of a strategy. If you look at what's going on in China, is that I do a lot of work with people in China, and I don't blame them for what's happening. I actually commend them for their strategy on how they've created an economy that's improving the prosperity and well-being for their people, right? So in the United States, I think this is a critical time to do the same thing. And I think when I talk about shortening the supply chains, we can do so with this advanced technology that, Rick, that you mentioned. There's 3D printing, there's 4D printing, there's additive manufacturing, there's all these types of tools of manufacturing that not only brings a manufacturing base back to the United States, it also brings greater engineering opportunities. There's a multiplier in manufacturing. Even if the process is automated, there's a multiplier of 1.8 times the number of dollars that it costs to do the manufacturing back into the economy and other goods and services. So I think in our desire to have this global supply chain that has the term of definition of efficiency that's maybe outdated, we've lost prosperity. And like I mentioned, there's some of us who are going to face the pain of what's happening right now. But there's some communities that have faced the pain for decades now. So I mentioned Baltimore. I've done a lot of work with Flint, Michigan. And if you listen to, the city that was called Vehicle City, right? The first large General Motors manufacturing plant that prided itself in this glorious automobile culture, right? Now is a city of 100,000 people without clean water, right? And then you think about rural towns and all these different communities that nobody really pays attention to. This is a lack of a strategy. So I think the stock market doing so well and the job market, quote unquote, doing so well, disguise these cracks in our economy that now maybe is a good time to address. So there is a way to shorten our supply chain, and there is a way to do it cost effectively. It's just going to take a different definition of what we mean by efficiency. And I think the conversations that I've had, people are ready to listen to it. So I think now's the time to start talking about it.
Another great example right here in Colorado is the CEO of Project Cure, headquartered in Centennial, Colorado. Doug Jackson has shifted the entire focus of that nonprofit from shifting products to developing countries to helping our healthcare workers here in the United States. And the move was so quick. So I think the fact that Doug made that decision so early was tremendous.
Yeah. So one other thing I want to say is, I don't want anyone to think that what's happening in the world economy is I think there's circumstances in China, if you look at what's happened over the last couple of years with their economy, is they're facing maybe not the same structural problems that we are, but they're certainly facing structural problems. It's almost impossible for somebody to believe that a country of 1.3 to 1.4 billion people is having a problem with finding, is looking at a problem of automation, right? So there's people that are losing their jobs due to automation and low-cost labor. So I think, the economists and supply chain people I'm talking to in China are struggling with similar problems that this model needs to change. So, before this becomes some sort of ideological conversation of us versus them, I think, I don't think the supply chain as it stands is working for anyone. And if you think about, a continent like Africa that's got 75% of its population under the age of 35 and ready to bloom into this large market economy, they're not going to have the same opportunity as China with manufacturing because everything's being automated, right? So, you see regions all over the world that are facing the same shocks and same challenges. And maybe this is just a time for everybody to look at things differently. And I think the United States is the land of innovators. We should be the ones who change it first.
Well, I've heard that. Do you agree that people say this movement to, bring back manufacturing to the United States, that actually we're manufacturing as much, if not more, than what we did before, and that actually we've lost more jobs to automation than we actually have to offshoring?
Yeah, that's exactly right, Rick. The manufacturing as a percent of GDP has stayed flat for like the last 30 years. It's the manufacturing wages that have just collapsed, right? And that is exactly why you said it's a result of automation, right? But we have to be cognizant of the fact that if you look at the amount of goods that we get purchased overseas, we're like 15% of China's entire manufacturing is, I think it's 18%, is related to the United States. We need to look at these things differently. We need to look at, whether it makes sense or not for our healthcare system to be, at the whim of a supply chain that's 8,000 miles away, whether it's in China or Indonesia or India or wherever, right? And I think I think we're going to have to look at these things differently than we ever have.
Well, I think there's a tendency of business people to focus on one thing, which is bottom line. And that's the same problem in engineering. I tell my engineering students that, you say, I got it to work. And it's like, well, congratulations, but that's one of 20 different engineering parameters, right? It has to be manufacturable, it has to be maintainable, it has to be usable, things like that. And I think that's what we've lost in business is the security, value to our communities, value to our employees. When we automate something, we're not just losing manufacturing jobs. There's less people, so that means there's less HR people, means there's less staff on upstream. And so it's not just the people who were on the assembly line that lost their job.
Right. And one thing that I've been in manufacturing a long time. And so I've been promoting this idea for quite a while. So I think companies should move towards automation because I think that's what the economy and the supply chain is calling for. But I think part of that benefit of automation should include a cost associated with reinvestment. Because what's happened in any community where, if you talk about the first phase of manufacturing reduction, we're simply moving to third world countries with lower labor rates. There was a talk about reinvesting in these communities so that the types of programs, Rick, that you offer and Valor could be offered to people in these communities. That's something that didn't happen. So you're seeing this huge gap between the students that you have and the students that are in these communities who are being left out. So I think as a part of the responsibility of automation should be the accountability of reinvesting in our communities so that everybody gets the same STEM education that your students are getting at Valor, because that's the only way they're going to succeed in this new economy.
The question is, does service also have a supply chain? Because one of the things we're moving into is artificial intelligence, machine learning, deep learning. And one of the examples that I use is radiologist, and that there was a MIT professor and she was diagnosed with breast cancer, and she just happened to be working on machine learning and wanted to understand why they missed the diagnosis. So she went back in her images and looked at it, and then got permission to look at a whole bunch of other women's images. And there was an experiment that was done, and it said the average radiologist has an 8% error rate. They had a panel of expert radiologists. They had a 5% error rate. And right out of the box, AI had a 3% error rate. And so they said the next big wave of automation will be these routine white collar jobs, not just the blue collar jobs. So how would what are you preparing for that, Jack?
Yeah, I personally think that supply chains will become more virtual than physical. So around the world, instead of shipping these massive ships with 20,000 containers on the ship will ship electrons from place to place, right? And if you really think deeply about this, you can think about someone creating a design in Indonesia and it being manufactured in Colorado, right? And it's a similar concept that you're talking about in healthcare, in the radiology example that you gave. And you know what's going on right now with immunologists around the world, right? Is that we're creating this, maybe for a lack of better terms, crowdsourcing or peer-to-peer or whatever you want to call it model, that's going to make everyone better. And I think some people have concerns about this taking jobs away. I think that's not creative way of thinking the way things can be. So the technology is there for exactly what you said, machine learning for healthcare, whether it's a radiologist looking at cancer or an immunologist looking at a virus. But how do we create an economic model where everybody gets to be a part of it, right? So it's not just simply offshoring, or you could say offshoring radiologists work to India, or automating it to IBM's Deep Blue, right? How do you create an economic model where people are a part of it so that everybody can prosper, right? So you just don't have a few people who are engineers and software developers who are doing well and everybody else is on the back end of it. It's hard for people to imagine because we're still looking at it through the paradigm of our current model, and I think that's what's going to change. And it's very astute of you to tie what's going on with services to products, because I think they both should have the same solution to what we need it to be.
Well, Jack, out of respect for your time, I want to bring it to a close right now and share with you that, we were talking about healthcare here at the end, and on Wednesday, Dr. Arlen Myers, who's the CEO of the Society of Physician Entrepreneurs, will be our guest. And so we're going to take a deeper dive into healthcare at that time. I wish you the very best. And Rick, thank you. Do you have a final question, Rick, for Jack before we go, or any final comments?
No, I don't. I just think I appreciate your work, and I think it's providing valuable insight, and I'm tracking it because I'm trying to prepare my students to come to you.
Great. We'll take
That's right.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you both, and I will see you soon.